France's Emmanuel Macron has stunned the globe, announcing the intention to explore extending the French nuclear arsenal across Europe. As Trump's America disengages simultaneously as Putin's Russia steps up the pressure, Europe is being squeezed, and squeezed incredibly quickly. It sounds like a political thriller, but with the countless amount of noise and news coming through, it's much closer to reality than we might like to think. So join me in this video as I cover the stark reality of what it means for no longer NATO's collective defence, whether France can really replace the US nuclear umbrella, if so, how reliably, and what this all means for potential new normal, with more countries seeking their own nuclear weapons.
This is the Global Gambit.
How you going? Pyotr Kurzin here, Global Gambit. Enjoy the conversation, then consider subscribing. But, well, we're here because in late February, new German Chancellor Friedrich Merz came out suggesting a greater discussion about the role of nuclear weapons across Europe, followed up by Macron on March 6th, stating that he will launch a strategic dialogue on extending the protection offered by France's nuclear arsenal to his European partners. Macron reiterated that, well, nuclear doctrine has, quote, always been a part of European dimensions, but has stopped short of offering exactly how that might work out. Now, Europe's primary nuclear defence has come from the United States and is a decades-old symbol of transatlantic solidarity. France has a much smaller nuclear arsenal than its NATO ally, but Moscow has responded to Macron's remarks already by saying that this nuclear rhetoric poses a threat to Russia. Why is this all happening now? Well, unless you've been living under a rock, you might have known that the relationships between the French, the British, the Europeans, and the Americans more broadly are all in a state of flux. Transatlantic relations are, well, not exactly going swimmingly. Trump's stance on NATO has reignited concerns about the future alliance and whether or not, well, what he said famously in 2024, quote, I would encourage them, being Russia, to do whatever the hell they want, end quote, sending shockwaves across European capitals. The difference being, of course, that at that time, Europeans were mainly in terms of words and outrage, but little action. That is drastically changing considering the amount of summits and conferences we're seeing held across Europe and including in London just last week. But can Europeans really step up? Are they asking, can we go it alone? And if so, who fills that void? But is it actually going to be followed through in policy? Let's break it down a little bit more. So France is, as it stands, the EU's only nuclear power after Brexit and the UK left. And Macron is keen to position it as a potential deterrent for Europe. But there are massive challenges. Size matters, not only from an optic standpoint. France has about 290 nuclear warheads. The US has over 5,000. Russia, roughly the same. But moreover, Russia has 1,500 warheads actively, well, ready to go at any one point. France's arsenal is barely 5% of what the big players hold. And it's not clear exactly how many of those missiles are primed, which ones are sort of being refurbished or managed, and which ones are just not even close to being weaponized. France also holds a doctrine of, quote, strict sufficiency. Only enough warheads to deter an attack, and only for France's, quote unquote, vital interests. Macron has hinted that these interests include Europe, but crucially, France refuses to place its nuclear weapons under NATO or EU command. Then there's budget realities. France spends about $5.6 billion or euros annually on its nuclear forces, 15% of its defense budget. But that is, well, is that enough to replace the US's nuclear umbrella? On the face of it, not really. So while Macron talks about a nuclear role and importance of deterrent, which is a key aspect I want to come to later on in the video, it's just, well, the reality is that France's deterrent is simply too small as it currently stands, and Paris wants to keep that full control. So for it to be able to exercise a greater nuclear umbrella, one of those two policies would have to shift. There are, of course, discussions about where the UK comes into all of this. They have their infamous Trident system, whereby you have submarines with two nuclear capable ones always in motion somewhere around the world to ensure that there is never ability to know where they are. Ambiguity, strategic ambiguity being incredibly important. This also leads to a greater consideration amongst other European nations, including Germany, and at the time of recording, new news coming out of Warsaw. President of Poland, Donald Tusk, suggesting that Poland might have to consider getting its own nuclear weapons. But before we get into those ambitions, let me know in the comments, do you think Europe can, but also should, develop its own nuclear deterrent? Or is that just too risky for what it might mean for escalation with Moscow? Now, getting into the Polish and sort of non-nuclear countries and whether or not this would integrate seemingly well with France, well, Poland obviously feels very exposed on NATO's eastern flank. They have started making bold moves. As I said, Donald Tusk has recently said that Poland must, quote, consider acquiring nuclear weapons of some form, owning its own defense more effectively. Indeed, Poland has been the, you could say, militarizing power of the continent, seeing its budget for defense rising to almost 5% in a couple of years' time, already over 4%, well beyond the 2% that most NATO members actually require. By comparison, Sir Keir Starmer of the UK has suggested that rising defense expenditure for the UK to about 3% in 5 years' time. Poland, meanwhile, has been pushing for this large-scale military training for all Polish men, suggesting that there might have to be some form of draft to around 500,000 as a precautionary effort. Tusk argues that Poland is surrounded by the threats of Russia, Belarus, and this increasingly uncertain NATO future, and that Warsaw cannot rely no longer on treaties alone. Poland is also moving towards withdrawing from treaties banning anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions, signaling a shift to a much more aggressive security posture. Poland doesn't currently have any weapons nuclear program at all, but could theoretically host US warheads under NATO's nuclear sharing arrangement, much like Germany does at the moment. But this is even more about where the US really stands. So where does the US stand? Well, despite Trump's rhetoric, US officials across the political spectrum have continued to support NATO's extended deterrence. There are obviously different layers when it comes to how NATO works, and while Trump can make strong comments about the potential of disengaging from Europe in some ways, ending intelligence sharing for Ukraine, military expenditure and supplies, but that doesn't necessarily extend all the way to cutting off nuclear support. There is a huge difference between intelligence sharing, kinetic warfare, and nuclear doctrine. Washington still maintains hundreds of nuclear warheads across Europe, stationed in countries like Germany, Italy, and Belgium. But the political commitment is what's uncertain. And if you have political uncertainty, that can bleed quite badly into military capabilities and reliability. Trump's quote-unquote burden sharing strategy has made European leaders nervous, but also proactive. Will Washington's considerations truly be there in an all-out crisis? The US still views global nuclear deterrence in Europe as a pillar of its global security posture, especially with the rising tensions in Asia. Indeed, given the developments in Ukraine and general shifts in attitude across the world since, well, the end of the Biden administration in the past couple of years and now Trump, China has been increasing its desire to shift away from what's known as minimal deterrence, a desire to have a minimal amount of nuclear warheads, which allows you to, well, deter countries from being aggressive, but not enough that it, well, rivals that of Russia and America. China is seeking to shift this by growing its nuclear stockpiles to be as capable, but also to be seen as a quote-unquote nuclear superpower, because if China wants to be treated in the same levels, whilst it economically is the same size as America, it doesn't have as many nukes, and that can sometimes be seen as a little bit of a disproportionality on the international stage. Now, many US experts on both sides of the argue that Europe's nuclear security must remain in America's responsibility to ensure that any kind of such conversations between Europe and China, for example, are off the table. However, if Trump pulls US troops out of Europe, as he's also suggested, or weakens NATO's cohesion, well, then some allies may have to start looking to nuclear options of their own as the final and largest level of deterrence. So how would this all shift in Europe's nuclear posture in terms of non-proliferation, which is the key point I want to make in this video? The impact of a shift in Europe's nuclear posture on non-proliferation architecture, which is a pretentious way of saying, well, we don't want more nukes, will depend on the nature of the change. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, the overarching treaty that has managed a lot of countries' attitudes towards nuclear weapons, prohibits new countries from developing nuclear weapons of their own, and is the foundation of the global nuclear order. But it does not explicitly address NATO nuclear sharing. Because of how comprehensive and complicated NATO is, it's always a little bit point of debate. NATO members argue that nuclear sharing does not violate the NPT in some regards because the weapons remain under the US control in peacetime. In an extreme scenario, for example, you could potentially see French or British nuclear weapons being positioned in places like Germany or Poland. the limits of which the NPT would be stretched, but some would argue it still doesn't violate. Germany would not receive direct control over the warheads, but critics argue that such a move violates the treaty in spirit and even more explicitly in terms of action. We can look at, well, Ukraine, of all countries in the 90s, which had a large nuclear arsenal of its own. But the key misnomer people seem to misunderstand is that they never had the control nor ability to utilize those weapons. It's the same as Belarus, where the Russians have positioned nuclear weaponry within different parts of the country. But of course, Moscow is not going to relinquish the ability for the Belarusians to launch and activate those warheads. Key differences here matter. And if you hear people mentioning about World War III or a media imminent Armageddon, they probably don't know what they're talking about. I like to believe I do, and if you appreciate that, then again, consider subscribing and let's have a proper conversation about it. Russia recently indeed tested these boundaries by deploying those nuclear weapons, and, well, all this rhetoric about Europe being the ones to escalate seems more like Europe is just responding in a tit-for-tat kind of manner. Less drastic shifts coming to that point, though, is that you could potentially see nuclear-capable aircraft stationed in Germany or other European allies who would express their interest. Might not directly challenge the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but would feed criticisms, particularly amongst non-nuclear states in the global south most of all, where double standards, again, in Western rhetoric versus policy, come to fruition. Such a move would trigger additional ripple effects inevitably. For many months now, so the South Koreans and Japanese populations have been more open to the idea of their respective nations getting a form of nuclear weaponry. The South Koreans, Japanese, fear the worries over North Korea and the constant nuclear testing. We can consider the fire and fury period of early 2017, when Trump first was in office, when the North Koreans launched an unprecedented amount of missiles over the Sea of Japan and other areas, which led to the flurry of diplomatic activity and Trump's infamous crossing of the DMZ line and the first handshake between Korean leaders since the Korean War in the 50s. Point is, we are seeing a reversal. We are seeing a regression, arguably. Whether or not the French can commit to some kind of nuclear umbrella is different to, well, talking about it. But the point still stands that these are conversations that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, would never have been held at all. It's all well and good to consider or not whether the French can do it, but it sets a dangerous precedent for other countries around the world. A new normal, a new reality, as countries feel that they can no longer depend on not necessarily just the United States, but an overall instability and uncertainty prevailing over the international system, and that they have to do more for themselves in terms of protection and deterrence by getting the most dangerous weapons humans have ever created. So what's the verdict here? France, it has the nukes, but does it have enough to cover Europe? Or would it not even be able to do that because of France's unwillingness to relinquish some form of control? Poland, it wants to rearm itself. Well, and potentially new arm itself with nuclear weapons. But, well, would that really be supported by the broader European Union and what's left of the NATO alliance? The US still provides a deterrence, but its long-term commitment? How doubtful should we be? Ultimately, replacing the US nuclear umbrella isn't as simple as just having a couple of warheads. It's about the doctrine, the credibility, and the willingness to use them. And right now, Europe doesn't seem to have a clear answer on all of those. This isn't necessarily an endorsement of nuclear doctrination. It's more a point that if we're going to be abandoned by the United States, then Europe really needs to step up. And unfortunately, nuclear weapons might have to be a part of that conversation. But what do you think? Is it time for Europe to develop its own nuclear deterrence? Or should NATO try to stick together as much as it can, even if the United States were to severely lessen its activity within the alliance? Just because the US isn't as active in NATO doesn't mean it can't still exist, surely? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you made it this far, well, you clearly like geopolitical issues, strategy, and thinking properly about complicated issues. So in that case, well, as we say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be played, just not with nuclear weapons. See you all next time. Take care.